Hey, welcome to Mineral Talks Live, the weekly live webinar that brings you in-depth and in-person interviews with the mineral people from around the world. Mineral Talks Live is brought to you by a joint effort among the Mineralogical and Geological Museum at Harvard University, the Society of Mineral Museum Professionals, and BlueCap Productions. Tune in every Wednesday and stay connected to your mineral world. Now, broadcasting live from beautiful Honolulu, Hawaii, the land of aloha, ukuleles, and shakas, this is Mineral Talks Live. Hello and happy August to all of you. Welcome to Mineral Talks Live. Today is Wednesday, August 4th, and we'd like to welcome you to our show. For those of you tuning in for the first time, Mineral Talks Live is the monthly talk show where we sit down with people from all facets of the mineral world to learn about what they do and who they are. I'm Brian Swoboda, the president of BlueCap Productions, and together with Dr. Raquel Alonso Perez from the Mineralogical and Geological Museum at Harvard University and Dr. Eloise Gaillou from the Society of Mineral Museum Professionals, also known as the SMMP, we are the Mineral Talks Live team. In our 51 shows that we've produced so far, we've been honored to sit down and chat with curatrix, curators, collectors, dealers, miners, researchers, artists, and various friends from the media. We send our thanks to all of them, and we also send our thanks out to you, our viewing audience, who allow us to come into your home and offices with our show. As this is as much your show as it is our show, we invite you to participate throughout this live show, either through the chat feature or the Q&A feature, both of which are located at the bottom of your Zoom window. The chat feature allows you to type messages to everyone watching the live show. As we're all about community, when you first sign on, go ahead and fire off a hello to everyone telling us where you're from. Also, if you have a general thought or comments during the show, this is where you can post them and interact with each other. Usually our guests and I won't be able to read those comments, but Raquel and Eloise will be very active in the chat area and may interject with a question or two during the interview. And speaking of questions, if you have any questions that you really want to ask our guests, go ahead and type it in the Q&A section, and we'll do our best to get to that at the end of the show. Finally, at about 40 minutes into the program, you'll see a window pop up on the screen asking a bunch of questions for our Quick Fire 5 segment. This is where we get to see how well you know our guests, and yes, we play along too, as we're not even sure of all the answers to the questions we ask. Now, on to today's show. Our guest for today is coming to us live from the Golden State of California, where he works as the Senior Manager of Research at the Gemological Institute of America, better known as the GIA. So, what does a Senior Manager of Research do? Well, we're about to find out. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Aaron Palke to our show. Hey, Aaron, how are you doing, buddy?
Great. Thanks for having me, Brian.
Hey, thanks for being here, man. Really happy to see you. How's the weather down there in California right now?
Oh, it's sunny and beautiful as always. It's hard to complain.
Yeah. I think if you complain of a bad day, everyone's like, yeah, but it's California, so whatever.
Yeah, I mean, I grew up in Oklahoma, and so I'm used to like the really intense weather. The only thing I complain about is we don't get thunderstorms and tornadoes and that sort of thing, but it's hard to complain about that.
Yeah, but you got the earthquakes now, so I think it kind of evens out in the end. Hey, Aaron, at the start of every show, I really like to turn back the clock on our guests, and so I'm going to do it with you right now. Tell us about how you decided to start studying geology. What was your initial influences? How did you kind of go down that path?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, I grew up in Oklahoma. I was born in Texas. And so you might not think of like Oklahoma as being a very fertile breeding grounds for an aspiring mineralogist, right? We have a lot of geology in the area, but most of it's underground, right? It's a lot of petroleum engineering and oil recovery. But the way I got involved in minerals, and the reason I wanted to become a geologist, was my folks are both from Montana. And so summers are typical, like summer break vacation was to drive up to Montana. And so we'd go, a 20-hour long drive up to Montana. And most of that 20 hours was pretty boring. Flatlands through Nebraska and Kansas. And then as you got into Wyoming and Montana, you start going up to the mountains. And so what sort of piqued my interest and what sort of started me wondering about the earth and how the earth works and how, what causes everything we see around us is, this progression from the flatlands and the plains in Oklahoma and Kansas into Wyoming. And then as you rise up into the mountains, it's like, well, why do they have mountains here and not in Oklahoma? What's going on that's, you don't have much to do in those 20 hours driving up to Montana from Oklahoma. So you have nothing to do but look at the slow progression of the changes in scenery as you go to drier climates. You start climbing up in the mountains and seeing all these different formations going on. And so that really was part of what started me thinking about the Earth. Now, the other part is, so my father is from Eastern Montana. My mother's from Butte. And so, especially Butte's a big mineral town. And so what I really loved to do when we went to Butte was we'd go to the Berkeley pit and we'd see the big open pit mines. We'd go to the Montana Tech, to their museum, and see all the, amazing mineral specimens. And I was like, well, why don't we have that in Oklahoma again? And what's going on here that's causing this place to be different from where I am and where I grew up? And then also my father from Eastern Montana, there's actually some quite interesting minerals out there. And I think I sent you a photo. I don't know if we want to pull it up, but one of the things that I really loved was going hunting for agates with my father. This is a picture of me, I think around 8 or 9 years old, proudly showing off some mineral specimens, some agates I had found out there going through the rivers in Eastern Montana. And also, but my father had also gone to Butte for graduate school, and he had, because Butte's such a big mining town, he had developed his own mineral collection, which he later kind of gave to me because I was the one who was always going through his mineral collection and looking at all his rocks and minerals, and it was easier just to kind of hand off that mineral collection to me. And so this was kind of what sparked my interest in minerals. I loved going out in the field, and he really encouraged me in this aspect as well. So we'd go out digging for agates and petrified wood out in Eastern Montana. We'd go out looking for gypsum in the salt plains there. And then we'd go out other places in Montana when we went up on our summer breaks, looking for quartz crystals and other types of mineral specimens. And so, I really got hooked at an early age. And I think what really interested me most was sort of like the nice crystal forms. I loved crystals, and I was amazed by the symmetry and how these different crystals can form with all these, systematic and consistent patterns. And as a young child, I found that really fascinating. So that's what started me off in geology.
I absolutely love that. And it makes perfect sense that as a researcher, your initial introduction to geology was based on observational science. You're taking these long road trips and you start asking those eternal questions. Why are there mountains here and not back home in Oklahoma? Why are things forming like that? That makes so much sense. And I guess in hindsight now, it's easy to see how you ended up in the research. But somewhere along the lines, you went from a passion for geology and minerals into gemology. So how did that switch happen?
Yeah. So, okay, let's fill in the blanks, I guess, in between there. So I actually never really intended to become a gemologist. I just wanted to be a geologist, and more specifically a mineralogist. So I ended up getting my bachelor's degree in geology from University of Tulsa. And then I went off to get my graduate degree, a PhD in geology from Stanford University. And so this is kind of a little bit of a sidetrack in my path towards gemology. But at Stanford University, I was working with a professor, Jonathan Stebbins. He runs a lab called a nuclear magnetic resonance lab. And if you want to get more specific, it's called, the specific technique we did was MAS NMR, which is magic angle spinning nuclear magnetic resonance. And I don't want to get too much into the nitty gritty details. Essentially, NMR technology uses sort of the same type of technology that you get in an MRI at the hospital. So when you're going to get imaged, essentially what we're doing in this case is we're looking at this in a spectroscopic kind of way. So we're using this as a spectroscopy to get an idea of how different minerals and earth materials are put together at the atomic level. Most of what he did was with glasses, and he was doing glasses specifically as sort of an analog to magmas and lavas in the earth. So NMR is a really good technology for this because you can look at small scale local order in materials like this. So a glass has no long range order. You can't really use X-ray diffraction or typical diffraction techniques very efficiently in glasses. And so what you can do is look at NMR, which gives you a more small scale structure. And now I didn't really want to do glasses because I knew I wanted to be a mineralogist. So I used this technique to try to look at small scale, short range ordering in different minerals in the earth. And so that was what I was doing in my PhD. I loved it. I thought it was really fascinating. But then I started looking around for jobs after that. And I realized there's sort of not a whole lot of opportunities for that kind of specific application in the field of mineralogy. And so I started looking around, and I eventually saw this place called GIA, and it was located down in Carlsbad, California. And they had just offered this new postdoc program. So GIA has always been involved in research, but recently they've started this program, the postdoc program, where we bring in recent PhD graduates to kind of work with the gemologists and the gemological researchers here. And so that kind of piqued my interest. It seemed a little strange at first. I'd never really heard of the GIA because I was completely outside of the gem world at the time. And so I was almost like a little suspicious of like, what is this place? But I decided to go for it. And I'm really glad I did, because I ended up getting the job, and I came down to Carlsbad and started working with all these wonderful gemologists here at GIA. And I kind of realized that this was my passion, the gemstones. Even though it's not something I'd really ever thought of before, I realized the analogs and sort of the connections between the mineral world and the gemology world. And I realized this is like the perfect applied, perfect way to do applied mineralogy. So where I take all these concepts I've learned from minerals and apply them to some specific problem in society. So that's kind of how I ended up at GIA.
Well, that makes perfect sense. Now, for the two people out there who don't know what the GIA is, can you explain what the GIA is and what their mission is?
Yeah, so the GIA is the Gemological Institute of America. And the basic mission of the GIA is to protect the public interest in the gem and jewelry industry. And so what this essentially means is that we have varying different branches in GIA. There's education, we have lab services, and we have instrument development. Basically, GIA was started in the 1920s when there was this fellow named Robert Shipley. He was a jeweler. He had a string of different jewelry shops around the country. And he eventually started realizing that he didn't really know that much about gemstones. And this happened because apparently he made a few kind of embarrassing mistakes with some stones he was selling. And then he started looking around and looking at other jewelers and gemologists in the country and started realizing that a lot of other jewelers were in the same position as him. And so what he did was what any reasonable person would do, which is that if you realize you don't know something, you try to learn more about it. And so he went abroad to Europe and started studying in London about gemstones and gemology. And he started realizing all of these different ways that he could use a scientific approach to gemstones to help not only the jewelers, but also the general public to get more trust in the gem and jewelry industry, which was in pretty bad shape in the 1920s, 1930s. And so in 1931, he came back to the US and opened up the GIA. He established the GIA for the first time. It started off solely as an educational institute. So his mission was to educate jewelers and gemologists in the country so that they wouldn't make the same embarrassing mistakes he'd made in the past. Eventually, this sort of evolved, and there were different steps that happened later in time. GIA opened up established the Gems and Gemology Journal, where all of our research is published. Eventually, because there were so many people at GIA who were knowledgeable about gemstones, we started doing identification services. And so this started in the 40s with pearl identification services. If you brought in a pearl, they would try to identify what was going on with that pearl. This later morphed into grading reports for diamonds, and finally identification services for diamonds and colored stones as well. So just because we had all of this sort of nexus of gemological knowledge here at GIA, this morphed into our lab services, which is kind of where I am in this whole thing. And so our lab services, essentially what happens is people send us in gemstones, for either grading reports for diamonds or identification reports and origin reports for colored stones, diamonds, and pearls. And so if you don't know what you have, if you're a jeweler and you have a gemstone, you don't know if it's treated, you don't know where it may have come from, you don't know if it's natural or lab grown. It's always a good idea to send those stones in to GIA, where we can use all of our knowledge of throughout the years, all of this accumulation of gemological expertise to kind of answer questions about gemstones that a lot of the general public can't do on their own. And so this is essentially to protect the gemstone industry and to protect the public as well, so that if you're buying a high value gemstone, if you buy it with GIA report, it comes backed up with all the expertise of all the gemologists at GIA who are backing up what's going into that report.
Gotcha. And when did you join the GIA?
So I joined in 2014 as a postdoc. And actually, so I stayed for a couple years, and then I actually left for about a year. I went over to Australia and was a curator at the Queensland Museum and a lecturer at the University of Queensland. And I loved it. It was a great opportunity. I loved being in that museum for a short period of time, but I started realizing as I was there that my real passion was the gemstones, and my real sort of like place in life was to be at GIA. So I spent only about a year there in Queensland, and then came back to the GIA, and I've been here ever since.
Well, tell us about some of the things, some of the projects you've been working on last couple of years, or last few years.
Yeah, so mostly what I'm working on is I'm a color stone guy. So color stones means basically everything except diamonds and pearls. So mostly what we're working with is the big three: ruby, sapphire, and emerald. But this is such an expansive field of color stones. We kind of work on basically any stone that's not a diamond or a pearl. A lot of what we're doing is just basic identification. So is it natural or synthetic? Has it been treated or is it untreated? And then also we're continually starting to branch more into the field of geographic origin as well. And so this is one of our other services, geographic origin. You send us in a sapphire or a ruby, and we do our best. We try to look at all the properties of the stone and determine where that stone may have come from in the world. And so a lot of my research then is based on these basic concepts of like identifying treatments, identifying natural and synthetic stones, and identifying geographic origin. And so when I started, though, first projects I started on was Montana sapphires. And so this was one of the biggest things. This was kind of like the first, my first gemological love affair was with Montana sapphires. And so I started off
to your parents. Yeah.
Yeah. So I started off just kind of studying them from a more geological perspective. And what I started looking at the inclusions in these Montana sapphires and noticing all these very unusual inclusions in them. And I started realizing that we could use these inclusions in these gemstones as sort of a geological time capsule. And so that's a lot of what my work has been in the last few years, is trying to understand the geological genesis of gemstones by analyzing their inclusions. And so one major challenge we have with understanding the geology of gem deposits is that most of these gem deposits are secondary deposits, meaning that the gemstones are not found in the original host rock where they were formed. They're in the secondary alluvial deposits that have been weathered out of the original host rock over millions of years. So you lose a lot of geological context in this regard. But sort of what we're starting to do, and I'm not the only one really on this path. There's a lot of other colleagues at GIA, like Evan Smith, who's been working on the super deep diamonds. He's been looking at inclusions in super deep diamonds as a way to kind of get back at the conditions that are existing in the deep mantle where these diamonds are formed. But the idea is to sort of use inclusions as this time capsule to show us what was going on when these gemstones were formed. And so I started off with the Montana sapphires, and we were looking at specifically melt inclusions in the Montana sapphires. I might have some examples of that a little later. But we're trying to understand how these gemstones formed by looking at these little blebs of magma that were trapped in the sapphires as the sapphires were growing. And I thought this was really fascinating that we could get back at some information about the geological genesis of these gemstones by looking at their inclusions. I was guided through a lot of this by some colleagues at GIA, like John Koivula, especially, Nathan Renfro. I really loved coming to GIA because I started getting this different point of view for understanding the Earth. At Stanford, I had been doing a lot of this spectroscopy and studying gemstones in the lab with these big, expensive instruments. And I came to GIA and started meeting all these people like John Koivula, Nathan Renfro, and Shane McClure, who were studying the Earth and studying, gemstones and minerals from this different perspective, using kind of really basic tools like a microscope and simple gemological tools. And I thought this was really fascinating. And this is kind of what makes me love GIA so much, is that you get to have these different perspectives on how to understand geology and pursue geological research that you kind of don't get anywhere else in the world. So some other projects we've been working on, that's sort of one a little more geological focused. A lot of my research these days is more kind of applications focused. So we're getting more into spectroscopy and colorimetric analysis. So in the gemology world, we have all these terms of different gemstones like royal blue sapphire, pigeon blood ruby, cobalt spinel, and Paraíba tourmaline. These are all gemological terms for different gemstones that are based on basically the color of the gemstone and the way the color is created in those gemstones. But these are somewhat subjective terms. In mineralogy, it's a little easier to kind of separate different mineralogical species because they're based on very hard rules about chemical composition, structure, and this sort of thing. Whereas with gemology and these color terms, it's a little more subjective, and we're trying more and more to look for kind of consistent ways that we can start to separate out these different gemological terms, like these color varieties, and find more distinct boundaries, so that we can be more consistent in our calls with these different kind of stones. So we've been doing a lot of work with cobalt spinel, trying to unravel the different chromophores. The problem with spinels is it's kind of this mineral that takes in a lot of different elements, a lot of trace elements like iron and cobalt and other trace elements. And they all interact with each other. And it's sometimes difficult to kind of tease out the different individual contributions to the color of a mineral like spinel. So it's hard to kind of understand how much of that color is coming from the cobalt as opposed to the iron and other chromophores in the spinel. Same thing with like pyrite tourmaline, where you have the color caused by copper, dominantly copper and manganese, but you can also have similar colors being caused by iron. So you can also get these indicolite tourmalines that can be a very nice blue color that almost looks sort of like the blue color caused by some copper-bearing tourmalines. And so, we're trying to do work on how to tease out those individual contributions of these individual chromophores in order to help with our eventual color calls that we make on stones in the lab. Beyond that, just a lot of work with identifying treatments and identifying synthetic stones and geographic origin. Geographic origin is probably one of the biggest kind of concerns in the lab. We have all these stones from different deposits, mostly rubies, sapphire, and emeralds, that come from geographically distinct locations where the geology was still relatively similar. And so kind of what the biggest, most obvious example is sapphires, with Sri Lankan sapphires versus Madagascar sapphires. While they're very geographically distinct, they have very different historical and cultural timelines in terms of how they entered the gemological world. The geology in those two deposits was essentially almost exactly the same when those gemstones were formed. And so, during the Pan-African orogeny, Sri Lanka and Madagascar were bunched up right next to each other, of course, in the map. They were basically right next to each other. And so the geological conditions in those two locations were very similar. So even though these are geographically distinct, the fact that the geology was so similar between these deposits caused the sapphires in these two deposits to oftentimes have very similar properties. And so we're doing our best to go out in the field and collect samples for reference, to find different ways of looking at the stones, different properties we can look at in the stones, in order to kind of refine our processes for geographic origin determination.
Well, it sounds like you're doing very important work. And I know that in the gemstone world, some of those terms that you were talking about, like pigeon blood or Paraiba, they sometimes tend to be more of a marketing term. And I appreciate the effort that you're making in trying to more clearly define what a pigeon blood ruby would be, or what a Paraiba tourmaline is, or is it a Paraiba type tourmaline? So I think that's a very important role that you guys are playing. Going back to what you started studying when you came to GIA, which was the Montana sapphires, having spent a lot of time as a kid in Montana and getting to know the area because your parents were both from there, did your kind of field knowledge of the area come into play there? And how important do you think field work or field knowledge of an area is in the work that you do?
Yeah, I mean, for sure. Part of my understanding of the Montana sapphires comes from, field observations and going out in the field and noticing things going on there. And that's kind of becoming increasingly a more important aspect of the work of a gemological researcher. So we have at GIA this department called the Field Gemology Department. It was established, more than 10 years ago. Vincent Pardue was one of the big guys initially involved in this. He did a lot of great work with us at GIA and established this department and grew it. My colleague in Bangkok, Wim Vertriest, he's now kind of the guy leading our Field Gemology Department. And I work very closely with him on this. But basically the idea is that, especially for our geographic origin determination studies, we realize that in order to be able to do this properly, we really need a really robust reference collection. So we can't identify gemstones coming into the lab for origin reports. We can't identify them unless we have stones that we can compare them against. And so over 10 years, we've been going out in the field, collecting stones from East Africa, Southeast Asia, Australia, and South America, and then again, in the United States as well. Collecting stones, going out in the field and identifying these materials, bringing them back to the lab for our analyses back in the lab. One of the really nice things, though, as a geologist, geologist was that this gave me the opportunity to continue doing basically field work. And it's not quite the same kind of field work I was doing as a geologist so much. So as a geologist, you're going out in the field, you're mapping, you're collecting, rock samples from different places and your formations, and bringing it all back to the lab so you can kind of analyze it, map everything out, and make thin sections of your rocks and analyze them that way. It's a little more difficult. It's more of a different situation with gemstones, right? Because as I mentioned, gemstones mostly form these secondary deposits. You don't have that sort of geological context to map out. So we're not really doing field mapping in this cases. In a lot of cases, often the people who own gem mines don't necessarily kind of want you at their gem mines because they sort of feel like it's more of a secretive kind of, they don't want to let out their secrets. They don't want to necessarily know the world to know where their deposits are and how much they're really producing. So there's almost a little bit of a sort of detective-like work going on in our field work as well, though. Sure. We do get to go out and collect field samples and a lot of the rocks. And actually, I wanted to show off a few things for Raquel because I think she'll enjoy this.
Then they got to be green things.
Yeah. So, and this wasn't a trip I was actually on, but one of my colleagues, Jonathan Muyal, went down to Colombia in, I think, 2016 and was able to collect a lot of really fascinating specimens. So while our primary focus going out in the field is to collect gemstones, where the gemstones will be brought back to the lab and faceted and turned into wafers so we can analyze the inclusions and get trace element chemistry. We do have fun collecting rocks out there as well. So I wanted to show off a few of these things for Raquel, especially. So this was a really amazing specimen from the emerald mines in Colombia. You can see the black shale and the calcite and quartz veins hosting the emeralds. We have, a huge repository of these geological specimens as well, which are, we try to make available to outside researchers. We can't really do a lot of the geology work in-house. So if Raquel is interested, let me know, Raquel. We can maybe send you a few of these specimens for your geological studies. But, we do get to have some fun.
And her home address is?
This one was really fascinating. I love this piece. This is this nice little sandwich kind of piece of the black shell with these veins going through. There's no emeralds right here, but
that's fantastic. That's fascinating
piece.
Aaron, you may remember, but we got some samples from Vim. He was sending some samples from Ethiopia, from a few different places. So we have been using in the research we are doing.
Yeah. So did you get any matrix specimens from him?
No, because we have few from Colombia in matrix, quite few, and we also went down to collect. So I think in Colombia, of course, we could still get more. But thank you. Maybe I take you up for that one too.
Yeah.
Hey, so Aaron, you have to have.
That'd be nice.
Yes.
Egyptian emeralds.
We got few tiny ones, but they are rare. Yes.
They're rare.
Couple of deposits, the Vadi and Sikait.
So Aaron, GIA has to have quite a reference collection. Do you guys partner with museums so that you can borrow or have access to specimens that there would be no other way that you'd be able to access?
Yeah, we do on occasion. We don't have sort of really kind of formal ties with any other museum, but we will occasionally reach out to our colleagues like Raquel and Louise and people at the Los Angeles County Museum and the Smithsonian, and they're always quite helpful with providing samples. And one of the really interesting things with our field gemology program, though, is we are sort of building up this collection like a museum type collection. So when we go out in the field, even though we're not using our compass and doing geological mapping, we are exactly documenting the conditions of collection of these samples. We're getting GPS coordinates. We're documenting who the stone came from, which mine it was mined from, where, the conditions, what position of the moon in the sky when we were collecting the sample, and all these other different pieces of information. All this is being documented when we're collecting the samples, and we go back in the lab and put it in our database and store the samples properly. Everything's cataloged with control numbers and very carefully documented. So we are trying to run this very much like a museum collection. And I'd be happy, if Raquel or Eloise want to come see the collection at some point, we'd be happy to show you guys. And we are more and more making this collection available to outside researchers, much like a museum would as well. So when there are university researchers who need a Columbian emerald or a Montana sapphire or a ruby from Vietnam, we're more than happy if there's a good reason for that research to be going on to send those samples to the people across the world.
Now, are you open to unsolicited donations from collectors and miners and people out there if they found something rare to send it over to you to add to your collection database?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if anytime anybody has something interesting to show to us, we're more than happy to take a look. This could either be through the lab or through our museum as well. So we have our collection here, which is the gemology collection, and that's sort of distinct from, there's also a museum in the educational department here at GIA, and they're sort of run a little bit separately, but we do communicate and work very closely together. Yeah, we're more than happy to take a look at any kind of interesting stones anybody has to show us.
Very cool. Speaking of interesting stones, I'm sure you've seen a lot of crazy things there. What are some of the most interesting things that you've found over the years?
Yeah, so this is kind of like one of the reasons why after I went to Australia, I wanted to come back to GIA, which is that I missed seeing all the fascinating stones that come through the lab. You can imagine that any time of day, there's like, a Casimir sapphire the size of your fist that's worth, 10 times the amount of my house. Or there's a Burmese ruby the size of a golf ball, that is worth, 100 times the cost of my house. There's fascinating stones coming all the time. We get to see like the top stones in the colored stone market here at GIA. And so I miss seeing that, but that's really not kind of the most interesting aspect of it. So the interesting thing is all the kind of unusual and strange things that come through the lab. One kind of story I want to touch on is this mineral discovery we made a few years ago of the mineral John Koivulite. So I'm going to show you guys the mineral here. You can see it. It's very small. And actually, I think I'll take out my phone and show you guys with my phone. So is that better? I'll turn like that.
Oh, yeah.
So that's John Koivulite there.
Wait, let's spotlight your phone there. There we go. There
we go. So it doesn't look like much, right? Not from this point of view. But this was a small mineral that a client had sent in to us in 2018 or something, 2017. And I'll show you in the microscope as well. I can give you a better view.
Okay.
So bear with me a minute. I'm going to plug my phone. So this is a device. I'm going to show you guys something in my microscope. This is a device I have to attach my iPhone to a microscope. And so what I'm going to do, this is the microscope. And we can take out.
Let's cut to the phone. Yeah, there we go. Okay.
All right. So here's my microscope. I can take out the ocular, and I'm going to show you guys some more examples of some kind of neat stuff later. And I put my phone in this device.
And that looks like it's just a frame to hold the phone in place.
Yeah.
Okay.
You see, it's got a lens in there, so it looks a little strange right now.
Well, it looks like the opening scene to a James Bond movie.
Yeah.
James Bond versus his arch enemy, Aaron Palke. You need a white cat on your lap now.
All right. So here is, if I can focus that.
Oh, look at that.
And so this is one of the two known specimens of the mineral John Koivulite. It's an extremely rare mineral. It's a member of the beryl family. One of the interesting aspects of John Koivulite is this distinct. So I've got a polarizer attached to the microscope right now, and all you see as I change the polarization angle, it's got a very distinct pronounced pleochroism.
Yes.
One of the most interesting things about this mineral. It's a cesium, boron, beryllium, magnesium-rich member of the beryl family. And so this is one of the two known specimens in the world. Basically,
now, where was it discovered?
Yeah, so we first ran into it in the lab.
Okay.
It was a stone submitted to us, and we ran the properties. We looked at the gemological properties, and noticed it sort of looked like beryl. So like the refractive index was similar to what you would expect for beryl. The specific gravity was similar, and the Raman spectrum. So we do Raman spectroscopy. If we get minerals that we can't really identify very easily, we can get a Raman spectrum to kind of fingerprint the mineral. And the Raman spectrum looked a little bit like what you would expect for beryl as well. But the chemistry was very weird. The chemistry was completely unlike anything we'd ever seen before with beryl. And so we started looking around more and more, and we tried to contact the guy who had submitted the stone. And actually, we ended up meeting him in the field. I'm going to turn that off for just a minute. We ended up meeting him in the field. He was a Burmese guy, and we just so happened to have a trip lined up to Mogok in Burma, the famous ruby land. And so he ended up actually being a person from Burma, from Mogok, a gem dealer from Mogok. And he ended up, we ended up meeting him there, and we ended up working with him to describe this new mineral species called John Koivulite. And so we named it after one of the guys here at GIA, John Koivula, who was a famous microscopist and a famous gemologist.
Right.
And so, this is one of those interesting things that happens in the lab. We get all kinds of unusual stones coming in. Sometimes you get sort of really unusual things where people, send in something that they think is a diamond, where they were out for a hike and they kicked some rock and they thought it looked weird, and they send it in thinking it's some kind of very rare and expensive mineral, where usually it turns out to be a piece of slag or something. But occasionally, the strange things that people send in to us are very unique and rare mineral finds, like the John Koivulite. Let's see, I got one more thing I want to show off.
Go ahead.
So I'm going to pull my phone out of this mount, so you can see the mount for my phone.
And is that a standard mount that you could get at a scientific shop, or where would one shop for one of those?
Yeah, it is a standard mount. And I think I have I might have the information here. It's a Gosky, Gosky microscope lens. Okay.
So people can just Google Gosky iPhone adapter or whatever, and they'll find it.
Yeah. So one other thing I want to show is a mineral specimen that John Koivula actually handed to me the other day. It's right here. So I'm going to show it on my phone because I think it shows better on my phone. So if you want to light my
Let's cut
phone.
back to the phone view. There we go.
There it is. If you see the form of the mineral, you might suspect what it is, but the color might throw you off. This is actually a euclase. And euclase is more often going to be seen as a nice blue specimen. This is a new find of euclase, kind of a podparacha type color, this pink orangey color in euclase. It's a new find from Brazil. I'm going to take it out of the box real quick. We think the color is caused by manganese 3+, potentially with some other contribution. I don't know if George Rossman's on. George Rossman probably is not on, but if you're on, George, I'll send you the absorption spectra once I collect them. But this is sort of a unique and rare find of euclase from Brazil. It just came out. I think there's a small production. Most of them have this nice crystal form.
Wow. Where in Brazil, do you know, or can you share?
I was told Bahia State, and I was told the name of the mine as well, but I can't pronounce it.
Okay, but in
I don't know. George is with us, so I'm pretty
George
sure.
is with us.
And I think he has seen some of those before, but that sonation is pretty interesting too, and the color is amazing.
Well, George, when we get the absorption spectra, I'll send it to you. You can confirm if it's manganese 3 or not.
Well, I'm sure he's jumping up and down and clapping right now.
There is an entire PhD done by a French lady, Laetitia Gilguéry, and she actually published a paper. I'm trying to find the paper back, and I will send it to you. She did the entire analysis on those pink euclase. I'll send you the link.
Awesome.
So now,
Yeah,
Aaron, what tools do you use in your work? You had mentioned a couple. You showed us the microscope. What else do you use?
So one of the things I loved about coming to GIA was I worked at Stanford with this NMR spectrometer, and this is like this big. You look at it; it's this big dewar of liquid helium surrounded by a big dewar of liquid nitrogen, and inside of that is this superconducting magnet where we do our spectroscopic analysis. So I was used to doing this really high-tech spectroscopy work. What I loved and what I found fascinating about coming to the gemology world was that the gemology world was doing all of this observational mineralogy that I had learned about in school, but I never had the chance to really do. And there were, I sort of thought of this observational mineralogy as being almost this dying art form, but really observational mineralogy is alive and well in the field of gemology. And we're using all of these kind of very simple observational tools to understand the formation of gems and minerals.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things I really found interesting were, like for instance, this, and I tried to use my phone with the attachment to kind of show these devices off. It doesn't work so well, but like this is a very simple refractometer. Okay. So this tool can tell you the refractive index of different gem minerals. It can give you the birefringence. You can tell the optic sign of a gem mineral. And so all these concepts I was learning about in like a petrographic microscope in my mineralogy classes, all these gemologists have been doing this for decades and using this in an applied way for tens of years. We have simple tools like polariscopes and spectroscopes, very simple ways of making observations about gemstones. The most powerful tool, though, in the gemology world, of course, is the microscope. And I think we're going to have some more examples of that a little later. The microscope, I think, is really one of the most fascinating and interesting ways to study gemstones. And I'm really fortunate to be able to kind of spend my life doing a lot of this. We do have some more fancy techniques, which I can't really show you. So there's some security concerns with me walking through the lab and showing off too much of what's going on because we have all our client stones here.
Right.
So the refractometer gadget is here. I think someone asked to see it again.
Okay.
Essentially what's going on. So you would attach a light source to this end of the instrument and you would place your gemstone here. This is a piece of glass. It's a piece of high lead glass with a high refractive index. And it's actually what you can't see below the surface is it's a kind of a hemisphere here. And so the light comes in through here and you put your gemstone on top of that piece of glass and it helps you essentially measure the critical angle of the light going into your gemstone. And so you would look in there, there's a scale, which I think you can actually see a little bit. There's a scale in there which it's calibrated to read the refractive index of your gemstone based on the critical angle of the light being reflected from the gemstone. And so you can do this, you can use this to measure the refractive index. You can measure birefringence. So you'll see two shade cutoffs in your refractometer. And you can measure how far apart those are. You can measure how they move and you can tell the optic sign of the gemstone, which is something you need basically like a petrographic microscope to do otherwise. But essentially, it's a way of you can identify most common gemstones by using this very simple device. Whereas in the lab at Stanford, I would have needed to go to the X-ray diffraction room or use the Raman spectrometer in order to identify a specific mineral species. It's done very simply, I think, with just using kind of standard optical mineralogy here in the Gem Lab. And I found this really fascinating that there was still this underworld of optical mineralogy that was still alive and well, and that's still being used very commonly throughout the world. So I didn't know that before I'd gotten into the gem world. We do have a lot of more advanced analytical techniques like laser ablation, inductively coupled plasma mass spectrometry, which is a mouthful, but it's also a way of measuring trace element chemistry of gemstones. So we brought this device in the early 2000s to identify beryllium diffuse sapphires. But the whole package cost maybe like $600,000, $700,000 total. So we found other ways to use this instrument as well, which the main way we use it is to measure trace element chemistry of gemstones in order to try to look for geographic, trace element fingerprints for gemstones from different geographic origins. So this is used a lot in our geographic origin determination to separate pyridotermalines from Brazil and Mozambique, to separate rubies from Thailand and Burma, for instance. And what this device does is it blasts a very small crater in the girdle of a gemstone, about 50 microns wide, about the width of a human hair. And it takes a little bit of material off of your gemstone, sends it into a plasma, the inductively coupled plasma, to ionize it, to turn that material into ions, and it gets sent through a mass spectrometer to get a full trace element profile of the gemstone. And we use other, a lot of spectroscopy. So we're doing UV-vis spectroscopy to identify chromophores in gemstones. And this is a lot of kind of built on a lot of work George Rossman has done in his lab, where he's identifying chromophores in gemstones in order to tell, is it a pyrite tourmaline? Is it a cobalt spinel? Separate things like possible Columbian emeralds from non-Columbian emeralds. We do Raman spectrometry. FTR spectroscopy is very important. So looking at beyond the visible range of wavelengths of light into the infrared, we can look for things like fillers and emeralds. We can look for specific hydroxyl bands in the mineral corundum for identification of heat treatment versus non-heat treated sapphires. A variety of other techniques like this to identify natural synthetic chrysoberyl as well. So a lot of spectroscopy, but a lot of this kind of basic observational mineralogy, which I think is actually really interesting. And part of the reason I love this job is that we have this confluence between these really high-tech instruments and the basic observational mineralogy that I kind of learned about in school. And it's taking information from these two disparate ways of looking at minerals and trying to get an answer about specific types of questions about gemstones, natural, synthetic, treated, where is the stone from? And that's kind of what I love about gemology. Here's the first stone I'm going to show you guys. Here first. It's a sapphire, a faceted sapphire. I've got it in this nice stone holder.
Oh, there we go. Okay.
And we're going to put it in the scope. So I guess we can switch back over to the spotlight, the other one. Here's the stone in the microscope.
So this is a faceted sapphire in the microscope, ladies and gentlemen.
Turn this around. See a little bit of idea of what I'm doing here. So I'm going to bring in this fiber optic light. I'm going to show you guys something that we would look at the stone in the lab. So I guess the reason I'm showing this stone is that I want to highlight sort of the power of our basic observational mineralogical observation for answering questions about gemstones. So I could take this stone and put it in our FTR spectrometer. I could get the refractive index. I could get a trace element analysis using laser ablation ICP-MS and figure out something about the stone. Or I could just put it in the microscope. And one thing I would see in the microscope is this.
Well, to quote Don Ho, tiny bubbles.
Exactly. So here's one thing I would start looking for in the microscope. These tiny bubbles. And this automatically tells us something about this gemstone that we should be paying attention to.
Uh-huh.
There's one more thing I can show. I'm going to take this diffuser plate. So the diffuser plate is going to help us look through transmitted light to look for color zoning in the stone. I see, if I can find it again. There we go.
I almost feel like I need to fill some audio in here, but I'm just unfascinated. I'm like, this is like a Where's Waldo? I'm looking for what it is.
You see here these bands start to appear. I'm going to try to get in better focus.
You can see them there. Yeah,
you see the bands in the upper facet there.
Right.
Kind
so
of
they
the,
cut through the
10
stone
o'clock
right
position.
And these are what we call curved striae. It's a little hard to make them out, but you can kind of see them cut through here. So what this is telling us, together with those gas bubbles, I don't know if anybody wants to guess in the comments what this is telling us about the stone.
Anybody? Bueller?
So these gas bubbles, well, someone says it's a fake. Yeah. So I wouldn't call it so much a fake, but I would call it a lab-grown sapphire based on these curved striae and those gas bubbles we saw. I want to maybe walk you through some of the things I started noticing about Montana sapphires initially, which kind of led me to my love affair with Montana sapphires. So here's another stone. This is a natural stone. And there's one inclusion right here. Sorry, I've lost my bearings.
So you're adjusting the focus on the microscope itself.
Yeah.
Okay.
Someone mentioned liquid inclusions.
Exactly. So these liquid inclusions here, what I'm trying to show off.
So we're looking at the circular object kind of at the 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock position.
Right. And so what I found about the Montana sapphires and what I did a lot of my postdoc work on was these inclusions. And while they look like liquid inclusions, these are actually little melt inclusions. So this is an inclusion here with the gas bubble. It's actually a glassy type inclusion in this Montana sapphire. And so this is this vestigial remains of the magma that was present when the sapphire was forming. We can slice into that inclusion and analyze its chemistry in order to get an idea of how this sapphire formed and what kind of geological environment it was formed in.
Now, excuse me for the uneducated question here, but we had gas inclusions in the synthetic sapphire that we looked at, and we have gas inclusions in this natural Montana sapphire. How do you use that to determine what is naturally grown and what is synthetic? Is it a grouping of multiple micro bubbles like we saw in the synthetic sapphire?
Yeah, so in the synthetic sapphire, it was just those single bubbles of gas trapped into the sapphire, whereas in this case, it is a sort of a liquid inclusion, a fluid inclusion, where that gas would have precipitated out of the glass, out of that magma that was trapped in the inclusion initially. So when it's trapped together with a fluid or glass, then it would be an indicator of more of a natural origin. So if it's just those single isolated gas bubbles, those don't really ever occur naturally in geological environments where we form corundum.
Okay, let me ask you a question about Montana sapphires. And I think this confuses some people, but all Yogo sapphires are Montana sapphires, but not all Montana sapphires are Yogo sapphires. What would be some of the telltale signs that you would find that would identify a Yogo sapphire versus a non-Yogo Montana sapphire?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So we have Yogos and then Montana sapphires, and you might call the other Montana sapphires secondary Montana sapphires. Yogo formed in this primary environment in this dike rock. So this magma that intruded the Earth's crust in this very thin vertical band of intrusion, of magma intrusion. And so the Yogos are distinct from the sapphires we find at like Rock Creek or Missouri River, where they're found in these secondary deposits. And one thing actually that you might look for, which if you spotlight the microscope, this would be a typical scene for a secondary Montana sapphire. A lot of silk, what we call silk, arranged in these hexagonal bands. So I'll zoom out. This is the sapphire here.
Gotcha.
So this is not a faceted stone, but it's polished into a wafer. But what you see is these hexagonal bands of silk. And so silk is this inclusions of micro-inclusion mineral rutile. And they're often oriented with the corundum host and arranged in these hexagonal bands. So you'll see this a lot in the secondary sapphires. You'll never see silk like this in a Yogo. Yogos are known for being very, very clean. The Yogos are usually very clean, no silk, and their blue color is natural. So the Yogos never really need heat treatment in order to improve their blue coloration. Now, with this stone, it's essentially kind of a colorless, very maybe light blue sapphire. If it were cut into a faceted stone, it probably wouldn't be very intense blue. But what you could do with that silk, you could take that, if you heat treated this stone at very high temperature, you could cause that silk to sort of dissolve back into the corundum lattice, creating blue color. So the blue color in sapphire is caused by iron titanium pairs in the crystal lattice. And so these Montana sapphires have quite a bit of iron in them, but there's usually not a lot of titanium. So if you take those rutile inclusions in the silk and dissolve into the corundum lattice, you all of a sudden release all this titanium into the corundum lattice, and it can pair with the iron that's also there, causing this blue color. And actually, I have a great example of that I had prepared. So we cut back to the
microscope.
Camera, microscope. This is a heat-treated Montana blue sapphire. And so when we look at the silk in this stone, you can see all these blue patches of that silk. So that silk, you can kind of make out that hexagonal pattern to it still.
Okay.
But you're also seeing sort of this blue color bleeding out of that silk as well. And if I use that diffuser plate that I'd shown with the this synthetic sapphire, now you can see all that silk is correlated with these blue patchy zones.
So that's the thumbprint of a heat-treated Montana sapphire.
This is how you would identify heat-treated stone. And this is also one of the fundamental differences between Yogos and the Montana sapphires, the secondary Montana sapphires, is that the secondary Montana sapphires usually need this additional heat treatment in order to produce that nice blue color in them.
Fascinating.
You can also see there's some kind of altered crystals, all these fingerprints kind of at like the 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock position.
Aaron, what kind of magnification are we looking at here? What is the times factor here?
Yeah, so right about here is on my microscope, it's about 2x, and then there's a 10x in the ocular, so that's about 20x objective.
Wow. Okay, so you have some hand loops that go up to 20x. So if you happen to catch the light in the right way and knew what you're looking for, could you actually see this kind of thing in the field? Or do you need that special lighting with the diffusion plate? If it were this obvious, you could probably identify that in the field. You wouldn't need, this diffuser plate's nice, but if you have like a thick sheet of paper or something, that can also act as a nice diffuser plate as well. Sure. So very cool. Those were kind of the examples I wanted to show in the microscope. So I just wanted to highlight, I guess, how kind of powerful this tool is. And that's like that synthetic sapphire we were looking at. Yeah, I could have put it in the LAICE PMS instrument and got a trace element analysis and identified it as a synthetic sapphire. And it would have been pretty straightforward, but we could have done it in 2 minutes in the microscope. Or the same with the heat treatment of this sapphire. It's done very simply by simply looking through a microscope. And almost, most of the questions we have to ask in gemology, we're going to be using the microscope in some way in order to get more information about it, in addition to all those kind of advanced analytical techniques we use. I love it. I mean, that was, I think, the first way of examining it. And if we forget about that and just rely on the very high-end machines, then that might become kind of a lost art. And I love that you're able to keep it alive and show us how functional it still is. All right. Right on. Aaron, we're kind of at the top of the hour here, so we're going to start slowly ending the show here. But before we do, we've got 5 quick fire questions that we're going to ask you. You know how this works? Yeah, I do. Yeah. Okay. So just for those tuning in for the first time, we've got 5 questions we're going to ask Aaron. He has no idea what these questions are, and he has to respond. There are 2 answers to each question. He's got to choose one of the 2 answers instantly. And these are the same questions that all you viewers have seen on the screen. And so, Aaron, all of your answers are correct. We're just going to see how well the audience has guessed what you might answer. So, are you ready?
Yeah.
Okay. The science with more passion, geology or gemology?
Gemology.
Gemology, he says, without hesitation. Better streaming service, Netflix or Disney Plus?
Oh, I got 2 daughters, so it's Disney Plus.
Of course, there you go. That to me was going to be the telltale signs if you had any children. Favorite meal, surf or turf?
Turf. I'm from Oklahoma.
Turf. Yeah. That was a giveaway. Cooler superhero, Hawkeye or the Green Arrow?
I don't know either of those. I'm sorry. I don't know. Hawkeye has a better sounding name. Hawkeye.
Okay, good. He's a Marvel guy, not a DC man. And final question. Next vacation spot, Florida Keys or Kauai?
Kauai. Sure.
Kauai. All right. Eloise, are you ready with the answers of what our viewing audience has guessed?
Yes, I am.
Okay. Number 1, the science with more passion, geology or gemology? Aaron answered gemology. What did our viewers say?
They answered right, gemology, even if gemology is only one little part of geology, in my point of view, but gemology is awesome.
Bing, bing, bing. Better streaming service, Netflix or Disney Plus? Aaron went with Disney Plus because of his 2 daughters. What did our viewers say?
Got that wrong, Netflix.
Oh.
Okay. There you go. Favorite meal, surf or turf? Turf was the answer that we were looking for.
Turf, indeed.
Bing, bing. Cooler hero, Hawkeye or Green Arrow? Going just by the names themselves, what did our viewers say?
Hawkeye.
Hawkeye, coming soon to a Disney Plus channel near you.
We're not sponsored by Disney Plus, by the way.
Not yet. And final question, next vacation spot, Florida Keys or Kauai? What did our viewers say? Kauai, right on. That's 4 out of 5. You viewers are winners today. Contact Aaron directly for your free Montana Sapphire. I only jest. Let's go to the Q&A section. I'm sure we got lots of questions from our viewers. Raquel, Eloise, take it away.
Okay.
Yes, I can go. Eloise, I know there were so many on the chat. I don't know if you kept some of them, but I'm going to go through the ones that we have on the Q&A. So the first one was from Antonio right at the beginning. Does the reason the diamonds are identified separately from other gemstones have to do with the cost per carat difference between the diamonds and the other gemstones?
Potentially in part, but a lot of the high value rubies, sapphires, and emeralds we're dealing with can be as expensive as fine diamonds in terms of price per carat. So I think probably the bigger factor is like the scale of operations here. So diamonds are even though it's they're beautiful gemstones, and it's you can never think of a gemstone as an industrial product, but diamonds are really mined and produced at more of an industrial scale level than a lot of colored stones, and so they're done in a more systematic, consistent way, and they're also in a lot of ways more consistent between deposits in terms of their color ranges and the way that they're cut as well. So it makes it a little easier to treat them in a sort of a commoditized way with diamonds, whereas really high valued colored stones are more kind of one of a kind, one-off type gemstones. They're more like each valuable ruby is very unique, and it's different from every other valuable ruby, and every other emerald. Every emerald is unique and different from every other emerald out in the market. And so the color stone market, because it's sort of more it's a little smaller in scale, it's more of these it's more of an intimate kind of one-off type situation. And so we'd have to kind of consider the different problems with these gemstones a little more carefully and a little more in an individualized basis as well. So I think that's probably more kind of why there's differences in the way they're evaluated differently.
Thank you. He also has a question. Does the GIA need or want to partner with universities who have ICP-MS? That one, I think, it's the flight of time. He works at the university, USF, and he was wondering about partnership with universities and GIA.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you should reach out to me. I think there might be some things we could work on. For instance, in our ICP-MS analyses we do here, we're doing just quadrupole ICP-MS. We don't really have the expertise to do anything else there. So we are interested, though, in like more isotopic analyses and more advanced analyses that more advanced mass spectrometry could help us with. So yeah, feel free to reach out to me if you have any ideas.
Antonio, also, by the way, Aaron is a great guy to work with. He's very fun to work with, especially on these research projects. So having a question from Flynn, will the GIA be working with the new gemology department at the University of Arizona?
We have some connections with those people there, yeah, and so I think we hope to be able to make some progress and keep those connections strong in the future. Yes.
Question from Maria. She remembered the big Yakult pink diamond affair. GIA described it as a novel form. What do you think? What do you do with the leftovers? Do you describe them as belonging to the nugget?
To be honest, I'm not so familiar with the Yakult diamond affair. I deal mostly with color stones, and it's enough to keep me busy. I don't have a whole lot of time for the diamond side of things too much. So I unfortunately, I'm not sure I can answer that question.
Does heat treatment decrease or increase the value of Montana sapphires? What about other sapphires? Is there any benefit to the heat treatment of other sapphires?
So all things being equal, if you had two gemstones that looked the same, had the same color, and everything else, the carat was the same, treatment on one of those stones will, the stone will be considered at a lower value in the market, simply because it's a matter of rarity, right? So stones that don't need to be treated to be beautiful and to be beautiful gemstones are more rare, and so they're going to be more expensive. We're dealing with luxury items here essentially. So all things being equal, yes, heat treatment will generally decrease the value of a stone. That's true for Montana sapphires, for other sapphires, for filling of emeralds, and for other treatments of rubies, and so on and so forth. However, I think you also have to consider that certain stones kind of do need to be treated. Like you consider tanzanite. When tanzanite comes out of the ground, most of it's this brown color, and it's not even tanzanite; it's called zoisite because it's got a brown coloration. Most of that brownish zoisite is not going to be if you keep it untreated, it's not going to be as valuable as if you were to heat it and turn it into a more attractive color. And I think the same is true for like a lot of Montana sapphires. A lot of them have these kind of very pale, low saturation colors in their natural form. And so there are a lot of stones that come out of Montana that can be unheated and have beautiful colors, but most of the production is going to benefit in terms of its color from heat treatment. So you do have to balance those two things. But I think probably 90% of the production of Montana is going to increase its value when you heat treat it because the untreated stone doesn't have that great of a color. So there's kind of some different ways of looking at that question.
So along that question of, do the people perceive a stone because would the dealers disclose that has been heat treated, or that's a different story?
That's kind of a different story. Yeah, I mean, I think most people in the gem industry are very honest people, and they're good people who want to do the best by their clients because that's the best way of doing business, of course. So a lot of dealers will tell you that sort of thing. Now, what part of the reason GIA exists, though, is because there are people who may not disclose that sort of thing. And, these treatments are fine with these gemstones as long as they're being disclosed. And so, but the reason GIA exists is that you can't always count on these things being disclosed. And so when a stone is sent into us, we'll be able to identify those treatments and identifying anything that's kind of happened to the stone that the client who is purchasing the stone should know about.
So this is my carry on with the same Montana sapphires. The stone that you showed us before, that was a rough heat treated. When you cut it, how much leftover of that treatment would still be visible?
Yeah, so for that Montana sapphire, you'd probably still have some signs of that treatment because the fundamental cause of the blue color in the heated stone is that dissolved silk. And so they're going to have to keep that dissolved silk in the stone in order to keep the blue color. So for Montana sapphires especially, you'll be able to keep some evidence of heat treatment. It's trickier in other materials. Some basalt-related sapphires, heat treatment's a little harder to identify. Some low-temperature heated rubies are a little more difficult to identify heat treatment. But especially for blue sapphires, it's very straightforward.
Hey, Aaron, I have a follow-up question when it comes to Montana sapphires. The Yogo sapphires are all that cornflower blue, but the non-Yogo sapphires from Montana kind of come in a range of all colors of the rainbow. We've been talking primarily about the blue. What about the other colors? What causes those colors? What are the chromophores? And are those subject to improvement through heat treating as well? And do they have the same kind of fingerprints as the blue ones that you showed us as an example?
Yeah, for sure. So the other kind of colors you see a lot of greens, which are basically blues with a little bit of yellow mixed in. So the greens will look a lot like the blue sapphires in terms of their heat treatment. So the way those blues and greens are treated is by heating them in a reducing environment. And you need the reducing environment to get the titanium out into the lattice and to keep the iron in the right valence state to charge couple with that titanium. There are some other fancy sapphires from Montana that are treated with an oxidizing atmosphere when they're heat treated. So these would be like the yellows and the oranges and the fancies and that sort of color range. And so what you're doing here is you're this different chromophore called what we call a trapped hole. So a trapped hole is basically it's where you have magnesium in the corundum lattice, and the magnesium has a 2+ charge. So in order to substitute for aluminum with a 3+ charge, you need something else to balance it out. And so basically what you do is if you heat it in an oxidizing environment, any excess magnesium in the sapphire can be charge balanced by a missing electron, what we call a missing electron on an oxygen atom. This is like the oxygen anions usually have a -2 charge. If you heat it in an oxidizing environment, you can change that to a -1 charge to balance that magnesium, creating this trapped hole. And this it's like a defect in the crystal lattice that is optically active, and it absorbs light in the range of about 450 nanometers, and it creates this very intense yellow to orange color. So you can also heat treat Montana sapphires in this way in the oxidizing environment. A lot of them, not all of them, but a lot of them will react to that kind of heat treatment as well. But you'll see the same sort of thing in the silk in those stones will be all, you won't get that blue diffusion out of the silk because you don't want to create blue color, but the silk will be very chewed up and kind of corroded, and you'll notice some the silk is all messed up essentially. Crystalline inclusions in the sapphire will be all chewed up and altered as well, because this is happening at like 1500 degrees Celsius. So it's high temperature enough that it generally produces some pretty significant changes to the inclusions in the stone.
Now, can you dial in the different colors from yellow to orange based on how long you leave it in there, or how much oxygen you have in it, or if you add any pressure? I mean, or is it all just predetermined and you heat it, you treat it all the same, and they come out all these different colors?
So each sapphire from Montana is going to have like a potential heat treated color. So if you have a lot of silk in the sapphire, a lot of that rutile silk, you're more likely to produce a very deep, rich blue color. Now, to get those fancy yellows and oranges, you have to have the right trace element chemistry. So what you really need is to have more magnesium than titanium. So the other way you balance magnesium in the lattice is to couple it with titanium 4+. So 2 + 4 is equal to 2 3+ aluminum atoms. So in order to get that trapped hole, though, you need to have excess magnesium in the lattice of the sapphire. So not every Montana sapphire is going to respond to that oxidizing heat treatment. It's going to be predetermined based on the trace element chemistry.
Interesting. And then I'm sorry for these questions, but I keep thinking of these things. With the different sapphires, with the different trace elements, are they all from different areas, or do you have one area with pockets that are relatively close to each other where they have different trace elements, or is it more diffused across a greater area?
You will see some heterogeneity in the trace element chemistry in the Montana sapphires. And actually, this produces one kind of unique phenomenon with the Montana sapphires. A lot of them have this kind of egg yolk appearance to them. So there'll be like a sapphire with an orange or a yellowish core. And so what's going on there, and you'll often see this with the heat-treated yellows and oranges, they'll often have this egg yolk kind of pattern to them. And so the core of the sapphire generally can tend to have more magnesium than the rim. And so when you heat them, they'll get these very vivid, rich orange cores that look like an egg yolk.
Okay, interesting. Sorry for interrupting the Q&A.
No, I think it's fascinating, and Aaron is the expert on corundum among many other things. But so we have another question along the same lines. She was saying that there are these 3 primary Montana deposits that they do not heat treat in the same manner. Are the inclusions difference related to these heat treatment differences?
Yeah, so there are some general differences between the 3 deposits. So there's Dry Cottonwood Creek, and I looked at the question, Rock Creek, Dry Cottonwood Creek, and Missouri River. The stones from Rock Creek tend to react more favorably to heat treatment. And that's because they have more, they tend to have more rutile silk, and it tends to be more densely concentrated in the sapphires. Missouri River is not as favorable, but it's still pretty good. And then the other deposit, Dry Cottonwood Creek, it's actually never really been commercially worked very much for sapphires. And that's because there tends to be a relatively low density of rutile silk in the Dry Cottonwood Creek sapphires. So they don't heat treat well. And there's not enough of those natural intense colors to really make it commercially viable.
Very cool. So now we are switching into instruments. Microscopes vary in quality. What capabilities like polite does GIA require in his scopes? Modern lumber prices, if you can talk a little bit about that. Yeah,
so this scope I have next to me, this is a kind of a high-end research scope. It's a Nikon SMZ 1500. It's also got a very high-end digital camera attached to it as well. It's also a Nikon camera. This is more than you would typically see like at a standard gemological laboratory at like a gemologist's desk. It's kind of overkill for most gemological work. We use basically just standard gemological scopes, but I chose this case because with the camera on there, I wanted to get like the best optics in the microscope to kind of show off things. But you could see the same features in a standard gemological scope. We'll often have polarized light attachments. Yeah, we'll have diffuse light. One of the biggest things that, again, kind of like the best accessory you can get for your gemological scope is a fiber optic light. And I was using that here as well. The fiber optic light is like fundamental for doing a lot of gemological microscopy. And I think, you can get a standard gemological microscope. If you've got a fiber optic light, you're going to get to be able to do a lot of high quality gemology work with that setup.
Okay. And this is an interesting one. When you determine a gem is a synthetic, how do you explain it to the client? Do you tell which kind of synthetic or treatment was used? Any war stories are welcome.
Nice.
So we do sometimes have to discuss things with clients who don't agree with our calls. We on our reports, though, we don't generally put the type of lab grown material. So we would not put like flux grown sapphire versus hydrothermal versus flame fusion. We just put, we just say that what it is. We don't put the type of synthetic, and we generally do not put the type of treatment either. One maybe possible exception is like with the emeralds, we will tell you like how much clarity investment there is on the emerald. But we wouldn't tell you, or at least GIA does not tell you sort of the type of filler that might be used in the emerald, for instance. Some other gemological labs will tell you kind of natural versus, or like traditional versus modern fillers. But for the most part, we're pretty non-specific with that sort of thing on our reports.
And similar, along reports, George is asking Adelman, he had a ruby tested at GIA in New York and had no mention was made of the natural fraction. Does your report usually contain this kind of information?
So not usually for identification reports, for colored stones especially. So with diamonds, there is more of emphasis on clarity and that sort of thing, because the diamonds are actually graded for their clarity, whereas that's not so much of a, we don't really do that thing so much with natural colored stones.
And then last question, what's the meaning behind all the binders behind you, Aaron?
This was all from before my time, so I don't know exactly, but I think it's pretty. I think it's for aesthetics.
Oh, I thought you were going to say it's your Hawkeye comic book collection.
Brian, I think that's we have a lot of questions. It was a very, very enlightening talk. You got a lot of congratulations, Aaron. Very good.
All right.
Very special.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Aaron,
Just
really
one
want to.
little thing. I know that
Go
a
ahead,
lot
Ella.
of people. I'm sorry. Just that a lot of people had very specific questions for Aaron on the chat, such as like very, very specific. So, is there any chance we can share your email with our audience? So, if they have more specific questions, can they ask them directly to you or?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah?
No problem.
Okay, I'm doing that now. Then I'm sharing it with you. And there were some questions related to the nature of the inclusions in one of the sapphire as well. I think you were trying to explain it, that it was one of the magmatic sapphire with a bubble inside it with a fluid inclusion. So people were asking if it was a corundum composition or if it was the composition of something else, like the magma, for example.
Yeah, so that was one of my research projects as a postdoc. I was trying to understand what those fluid inclusions were. And so in this case, it's a silicate magma. And actually, it was surprisingly, the composition was sort of like a rhyolite, essentially. So it was a lot of silicon, aluminum, and potassium, sodium, and calcium. So it was kind of like a standard rhyolitic type magma, which is a little strange because you tend to think of corundum doesn't grow in silica-rich environments.
No.
This was like sort of the hypothesis I produced was that, and actually a lot of these magmas, these magmatic inclusions were quartz normative. If you look at their the normative mineralogy. So what I proposed was that these were probably formed during partial melting of some aluminum-rich host rock, in which there might have been some peritectic melting reaction that created corundum as a rustitic component. So like when this rock was melted, it would have created the silica-rich magma and left behind this aluminum-rich residual where the corundum may have formed in this environment. And because the corundum would have been growing during this partial melting event, it could have encapsulated those blebs of magma.
Interesting. If you can share this paper or your article on that, it's really interesting. I'm always thinking about cyanitic composition and not rhyolitic composition when it comes to sapphires. So
yeah, well, you have those corundum-bearing cyanites in France. I don't remember exactly where they are, but
the pseudo in France, from the French Massif Central. I studied that during my master degree. So
for sure, I'll send you those papers after we get off here.
Great, thank you.
Right.
I love it when they talk science. Aaron, thank you so much for coming on the show. Fantastic time we had with you. Thank you for sharing all your knowledge and all your experience with us. Really appreciate it. For those viewers at home, tune into BlueCap Productions YouTube channel tomorrow, and we are going to be releasing our episode 51. That was our interview with Dr. George Harlow from the American Museum. If you didn't catch the show live, then you are going to get a wonderful tour through the newly reopened American Museum in New York City. So from all of us here at Mineral Talks Live, thank you for joining us. We'll see you next month, September 1st. Have a fantastic month. Aloha. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, and thank you very much, Aaron. That was a fantastic show. As Raquel said, a lot of congrats. And the lecture was different. The interview was very, very different this time, and it was much appreciated that we were seeing some inclusion and some live action from the lab. So thank you very much. Oh, one last question, actually. It was, how can people visit the GIA in Carlsbad? Sorry.
Yeah. So in ordinary times, we do allow visitors to come in and do a tour. I don't think they're doing those right now because of COVID restrictions, but you can visit the website, the GIA.edu. There's information on how to visit. I hope they'll be able to start doing those again, and you can come in and see the exhibits that we have on display and learn more about what's going on in GIA. So, I encourage everyone to come and do that in Carlsbad, California, whenever you have a chance. And, Carlsbad's a lovely place too. So come to GIA, come to the beach. It'll be a great time.
And the link was sent to people, so they have it. They will know how to search it. Perfect. Thank you so much again.
Thanks.